Welcome back. Here's your latest housing market update for the state of Florida. This is actually a report from the Realtors Association here in Florida regarding closed home sales, home prices, housing inventory, and much, much more. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I have a lot to share in today's video. Let's first talk about closed home sales, which of course is the number of transactions that closed during the month. The most recent stats we have actually is for July, of course. And by the way, in today's video, I'm only talking about single family houses, excluding condos. So only single family houses. So for the month of July this year, we saw a decrease of 6.4% in the number of closed home sales in the state as a whole. That's the smallest decrease in at least a year. Because you can see here, we saw giant decreases in the winter months down by about 36 to 38%. Now it's only down by 6.4%. But having said that, as a note right there, 22,000 closed home sales is the smallest amount of sales since February this year, when at that time there was actually just under 19,000. One thing I really love regarding their monthly updates here is they share how each of these metrics compares to previous years going back to 2019. Of course, I like that because back in 2019 was obviously pre-COVID. So it's a really good measure regarding, is 22,000, is that normal during this time of year or is it not? So in looking at this chart right here, I really wish they would provide the numbers here, but we can kind of just eyeball it here. So for July of 2019, there was around 28,000 closed home sales versus only 22,000 this July. And obviously, when we look at 2022, 2021, and 2020, there was a much higher amount of sales, around 30,000 to be exact, compared to only 22,000 this year. Let's also talk about the number of cash sales for the month of July as well. Around 6,000 cash sales. That's a decrease of 18.1% year over year. Now, a decrease of 18% may sound like a lot, right? But this is actually the smallest decrease on a year-over-year basis going back to last August. Last August, we saw a decrease of 17.1% compared to the giant decreases of 30 to around 40% that we saw at the last half of 2022. What I found to be interesting as well is that even though we're down by 18% from July 2022, it's roughly on par with July of 2019 of just over 6,000 cash sales then. And something else I noticed as well is that looking at sales back in July 2021, there was around 9,000 cash sales. In July 2022, there was just under 8,000. So we have far fewer cash sales compared to 2021 and the first half of 2022 here. Let's also talk about the percentage of cash sales as well, because for the month of July, it was 27.4%, a decrease of 12.5%. Something I found to be interesting as well is that this percentage of cash sales has been decreasing ever since February this year. So for example, in February, it was 31%. Now it has decreased to 27%. Kind of small decrease, but it has been decreasing for 6 consecutive months now. Also, when looking at pre-pandemic levels, back then there was around 23% of all sales were from a cash buyer. Now it's at 27%. So the percentage right now, even though it's lower compared to a year ago, it's still much higher compared to pre-COVID levels. And also compared to the first half of 2022, we're still well below those levels of around 35%. Let's change gears slightly here and talk about home prices for the state of Florida as a whole. So this July, the median sold price was $415,000, up very slightly from 12 months ago, a gain of 0.7%, when the median sold price 1 year ago was just over $412,000. What I noticed as well is that the price right now at $415,000, this is the first monthly decrease ever since January this year. Having said that, that is normal to see decreases in prices after the summer months here. Let me just kind of share that with you right now. So for example, back in, let's look at July 2022, just under the peak that was set back in June and May. And also back in 2019, the peak was also set back in June. So it is normal to see prices start to decrease during this time of year. It's also worth noting here that at 415,000, this is not too far off the all-time record high that was set back in May and July last year, when I believe it was around $420,000. The Realtors Association in Florida also provided the percent of original list price received. So for this July, that ratio was 97.7%. This means on average, home sellers sold their house for 2.3% below their original asking price. This has been paid at around 95 to 97% for quite some time here, but it has been steadily rising ever since January this year. Let's also discuss how fast or how slow houses are selling in the state of Florida, because days in the market is at 24 days this July, which is interesting because this is much lower than the 43 days we saw in February, which is a seasonal decrease because days in the market tends to peak in the winter months, meaning houses take longer to sell in the winter months and they sell faster in the spring months. One thing you guys should be aware of, though, is that days in the market increased by 100% or doubled from 12 months ago, because back in July 2022, it only took 12 days to sell a house. Now it's at 24 days. So houses on average are selling about twice as long compared to a year ago, but we have to provide some context here though, right? So in July 2019, days in the market was just under 40 days, which is obviously much slower than the 24 days we're seeing this July. So big picture here, it's taking longer for houses to sell compared to 12 months ago, but much faster compared to pre-pandemic levels. And frankly, that's a common trend we're seeing right now nationwide as well. In regards to the number of new pending home sales, this is a measure of contracts being signed between buyers and sellers. So for the month of July, there was 23,395 new pending home sales. That was a decrease of 0.8% compared to a year ago, so relatively flat compared to July of 2022. One thing that I really notice here, and this is kind of shocking here, we're not seeing the giant decreases of pendings like we saw in the last half last year. So for example, back in October compared to October 2021, a giant decrease of 41%. Also in November, giant decrease of nearly 37% compared to the only 0.8% decrease this July. When we zoom out over the previous 4 years though, we can provide some context regarding, is 23,000 a high number, low number, or normal? So back in 2019, at this time, there was around 28,000 new pending home sales, whereas this year, only around 23,000. It has been falling for the previous 4 months in a row now. So what does this mean? Obviously, we're flat compared to a year ago, but the decrease of pending home sales for the previous 4 consecutive months now would imply that closed home sales will also decrease in the months ahead as well. So that was a measure of home buying demand. Let's have a look at the supply side as well. This is the number of properties that were put on the market for sale. In other words, the number of new listings decreased by 23.8%. There was just over 27,000 new listings this July. So what caught my attention regarding this is that new listings are falling faster than the decrease of contracts being signed. So new listings falling by nearly 24%, whereas new listings were relatively flat compared to a year ago. So we're seeing a lack of new supply hitting the market right now, which of course is a big problem here. One thing we're not seeing though is the giant fallout of new supply hitting the market that we saw in the second half last year. So for example, you can see here back in June of 2022, there was 40,000 new listings, but after that, it absolutely tanked through December. Whereas this year, it's been relatively flat ever since March. One more thing I do want to mention regarding new listings is that at 27,000 this July, it's a little bit below levels back in July 2019, when at that time there was just over 30,000. So because the number of new listings had been relatively flat for quite some time now, It's no big surprise we're not seeing a giant increase of inventory like we saw last year. Let me just share the chart with you first here, because in May 2022 through the winter months, we saw a giant increase of inventory, unlike the previous 3 years here. Whereas this year, inventory levels have been relatively flat all year. To start the year, it was actually just over 60,000 active listings. Now it's at 61,000. So relatively flat this year compared to the giant gains we saw last year. So for example, in January 2022, there's around 25,000 active listings. And to end the year, we're at about 70,000 active listings. So a giant increase of housing supply, but compare that to this year, it's been relatively flat all year. And in fact, when we look at January 2022, again, there's around 30,000 active listings. And by the time we hit July last year, there was over 60,000. So a giant increase compared to flat this year. Also, when looking at the month supply in Florida right now, the month supply is at 2.8 months. 1 year ago, it was 2.2 months, a gain of 27.3%. Still relatively low though, even though we're up compared to a year ago at 2.8 months. Looking at pre-pandemic levels back in July 2019, it was just under 4 months. And lastly, here's one more slide I want to share with you guys, because here is the number of traditional home sales. In other words, not a distressed home sale versus distressed home sales, foreclosures, and short sales, right? So for the month of July, there was 22,043 traditional home sales. That's just a regular home sale, versus only 132 foreclosures or REOs, or real estate owned properties, foreclosures, and also only 23 short sales for the entire month of July for the entire state of Florida here. So by my nerdy analysis here, there was a total of 22,198 total home sales, which includes distressed home sales. Therefore, at 22,043 traditional home sales, that represented 99% of all home sales. Therefore, only 1% came from a distressed home sale, a foreclosure, or a short sale. Big picture here, the amount of distressed home sales is virtually non-existent at 1%, which is actually in line with the national averages as well, per the National Association of Realtors report just announced a few days ago. But what's your biggest takeaway from today's video? Thank you so much for watching today's video. I appreciate you. Hope you have an awesome day. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.